Oh, hey, Melvin.
Oh, hey, Arif.
Since we've launched this podcast, there have been a few people who've asked what they can do to help us.
Mm.
They'd like to support the podcast. What should they do?
Well, what you should do is go and leave a rating and review wherever you're listening to the podcast at.
Where's the best place to leave a rating and review?
Wherever.
Apple Podcast. Or if you don't think that we've earned a 5-star rating and review, please shoot us an email at loxpodcast@gmail.com and let us know what we can do to earn that 5-star rating and review.
Look at that customer service.
Look at that. Additionally, you could tell a friend. Let them know about how Life of X podcast has changed your life for the better.
The people need to know.
Lastly, if you're looking for other ways to support the show, head over to lifeofxpodcast.com and click on our support page.
Let's get in it.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Chadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this the Life of X. Hello, Melvin.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. How are you?
I'm tired, as always.
Been preparing for this episode for a long time.
Yeah, I've been waiting for this my whole life.
This is a long-awaited episode for you, Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah, Chiang Kai-shek. Man, this is a bear. This is gonna be a lot to cover. It's unscripted, so we're gonna do our best.
We are gonna do our best, and this is an exciting time. We just went live with the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We are speaking to you from the future. Hopefully, you will have listened to roughly 14 weeks of Life of X podcast before you hear this, but it feels great. We're very excited.
Yeah, very excited, and hopefully we're not going to mess this up.
No, but if you have been listening to all of our previous episodes, and if you haven't, how dare you, please go back and do so. You're going to notice that this episode is going to be just a little different. For those of you who don't know, Melvin is an old man.
Very old.
He's not ancient, but if you look at the timeline of a human's life as a hill, Melvin's definitely on the downslope. And he has dedicated a large portion of that long, long life to the study of China.
More than I care to acknowledge at this point in time, but I'm going to try to keep my senpais happy.
Yeah. So this is up Melvin's alley, and is certainly not up my alley. Having done my education in the United States, I pretty much touched on this period in Chinese history briefly in high school, and then never again.
Put it down, never to revisit it again.
Apparently it wasn't important. So my exposure to Chiang Kai-shek and honestly the entire period of China that we're going to be talking about during this episode is kind of limited to just this biography. But Melvin has been studying this for a very long time. I joke about him being old, but the fact of the matter is that we are on unequal footing in terms of background knowledge and that sort of thing for this. So instead of he and I sort of jumping back and forth in more or less telling the story of Chiang Kai-shek and talking about China and that sort of thing, I'm pretty much with you guys in terms of questions and not knowing things. And so as we go along, I will be asking Melvin questions that hopefully also address some of the questions that you will have.
So I think the biggest thing that's going to take place here is we're going to have a lot of fun listening to Arif trying to pronounce all of these names.
I'm not saying any of these names.
Oh, you're saying all of the names. All. I gave you a pronunciation guide.
You gave me a terrible pronunciation guide.
It is bad. But
it's so bad.
You can do this, Arif.
No, I can't.
Yeah, you can. Let's give it a try. Let's get in it.
Let's go ahead.
Why don't you lead us off, Arif?
Okay, so first name I'm going to get pronounced wrong. Do you say Shang or Chang?
All right, so this is a little bit of an issue. So the name Chiang Kai-shek is actually, how to describe this? This is actually Cantonese. That's a southern Chinese dialect. Nowadays, most of us that study Chinese, we study Mandarin Chinese, and we would pronounce his name Jiang. So you can say Chiang. So sometimes you may hear me switch between Chiang or Jiang, but if I say Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi, same guy.
Oh.
I'll try to keep it consistent.
Please do.
Okay, Chiang Kai-shek. That's what we're going to roll with.
All right. So, Melvin, talk to us about Chiang Kai-shek's early life.
So, Chiang Kai-shek was born on October 31st, 1887 in Zhejiang province, which is 150 miles south of Shanghai. His parents Jiang Xuan, which is his father, and his mother, Wang Caiyu. I actually don't know the tones on those, but I'm just flowing from the survival scrolls on that.
I could tell that you were just a little off.
So he was born to this family in Zhejiang province, and they're actually fairly well off. I mean, they're not super wealthy, but they're definitely not poor. His grandfather owned 5 acres of land outside of Shiko, a small hamlet. This made them one of actually the top 5 families in Shiko, but not rural gentry. Eventually, they rented out the agricultural land and began running a salt shop shortly after the Taiping Rebellion.
Quick question. Now, again, it's become a tradition for the show. We still haven't mentioned the book. It is the Generalissimo
by Jay Taylor.
And subtitles like The Making of Modern China, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent book. You should pick it up. It is very, very in-depth. But anyway, I think Taylor says in that book that the shop that the family owned was selling like government products. Did the government at that point like own salt and allowing them to?
I want to say that salt was a sort of regulated commodity.
Okay.
That the government would have had a hand in. But I can't say that they were selling government goods per se.
All right. And another question. I obviously am not good with the geography of China, but I looked up a little bit of what the Taiping Rebellion was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So would that have affected them in where he's from?
Absolutely. I mean, the Taiping Rebellion was, it definitely had major, I mean, really, realistically, there was no part of China that went unaffected from the Taiping Rebellion. They may not have been directly affected by the fighting per se, but it's actually possible that they were. We'd have to read up on a history of the Taiping Rebellion. But for people who don't know, the Taiping Rebellion is one of the most ridiculous things I think that you could possibly read about. It's almost unbelievable when you hear the details of it. Basically, there was this sort of Christian kingdom that was created in China by a man whose name...
The brother of Jesus Christ himself.
Yeah, he believed he was the brother of Jesus Christ and created this thing that he called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom in China. And he fought against the Chinese Empire, the Qing, which we'll talk about in more detail later. And the battles, the famines that were caused by it were absolutely devastating. This took place at the same time as the American Civil War. And something like 20 million people died. But Chiang Kai-shek's family seems to be doing okay. I mean, they're renting out their land. And they had their own general store, which was thriving by 1889, just 2 years after Chiang Kai-shek's birth. And his mother during this time would give birth to 2 more children, 2 daughters, but only one would survive infancy. Now, his grandfather dies in 1884.
This sort of makes him the man of the family, correct?
Well, his father is still alive.
Okay,
his father doesn't die until 1896. Now, when his father dies in 1896, he's the oldest child, age 9. You know, he's and he essentially becomes sort of the man of the house, and he receives the
bamboo grove,
but
not the salt shop.
Now, one thing that's interesting about this is what he did receive earned him roughly 50 Mexican silver dollars per year, which is a lot of money. A lot of people don't know this, but during that time, the Mexican silver dollar was highly, highly, highly prized. The Chinese economy was essentially, it was based on silver, whereas a lot of us, we think that
the gold standard,
everything's about gold, but no, these Mexican silver dollars were flowing into China, and these things, they loved them because the silver was so pure.
Yeah.
It was so good. So a lot of what they used to buy things, you know, these people with money, were these Mexican silver dollars. It's crazy.
Yeah, and so, I mean, bottom line, Chiang at this point is relatively well off. He's in a good position. And we've mentioned that Chiang was, at the ripe old age of 9, the oldest male in the family. He did have a younger brother who was sort of, it seems like from reading Taylor's account, I don't know if I would say the favorite, but Taylor describes him as a handsome and lovable young man, whereas Chiang was, quote unquote, neither handsome nor academic and grew to be rebellious and temperamental. But temperament aside, Chiang's mother was very involved, obviously, in her son's lives, and she was very ambitious for both of them. And she would go on to play a really big role in Chiang's early life and career even. I mention that because it's at this point, at the age of 14, she decided that it was time for him to get married.
Yeah, but this would have been obviously fairly common in China around this time. And she finds a bride for Chiang named Mao Fumei. And she is a young lady from a nearby village called Yando. She has partially bound feet, which
it's like when you hear about someone having bound feet or partially bound feet or whatever, and if you don't know what we're talking about, go ahead and Google image search that. You know, it is a process by which the foot in these young women was broken and then bound so that they had small and like dainty feet.
Very small, dainty feet. If you ever see the very small Chinese shoes, sometimes that, you know, people collect or you may see in museums, like those were actually shoes that people wore.
But what I was going to say was when you hear about that sort of thing or you read it, it's one of those things when you're reading history, this is like a different world.
Yeah, a very different world. And the interesting thing here is that she comes from a poor village and she still had partially bound feet, which was kind of odd because usually when you bind a woman's feet,
that was like a sign of like this person isn't going to do labor because she's not needed to do labor.
Yeah, it's difficult to do labor, right? Because there's a certain part of what made that attractive was, you know, there was the foot, but also it grew into other things. You know, the way that these women walked was also something that men at the time found attractive. So, you know, we would say had difficulty walking, but it was part of that cultural world and sphere. And so the marriage likely took place in the winter of 1901 or 1902. We're not exactly sure when that happened, but it doesn't seem like the marriage went off without a hitch. According to Mao Fumei's friends, he beat her from time to time, and they didn't produce a child immediately, which indicates that the marriage may have gone unconsummated for some time, for some years.
Yeah, you know, if you know anything about Chinese history or modern Chinese history, I should say, you know, Chiang Kai-shek is a controversial figure, but I would say, especially in his early years, kind of sucked. He seems like he was kind of a jerk.
I mean, there's no real good way to put a positive spin on beating women.
No. No, I mean, like, just from Taylor's early account, it seems like family and friends, they just kind of described him as a difficult person. And, you know, obviously we're going to get into the life, but he, you know, hits a few points where it seems like he probably turns himself around, I would say, or at least gives off that appearance.
Yeah, I mean, he was definitely a really complicated guy, which is going to come out as we talk about him in this podcast. There's a lot of things to envy about him, but there's also a lot of things to look and say, oh my gosh.
Things that make you go,
maybe shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
All right, Eric, you want to talk to us about his early education?
In 1903, Chiang takes the new civil service exam, fails it. But again, this sort of is where we see his mother stepping in. She's like, not my son. So she enrolls him in the Phoenix Mountain Academy, which was a Confucian school in a place that I'm not going to try to say.
Fenghua.
There we go. And at the Phoenix Academy, we kind of see the beginnings of who Chiang Kai-shek will become. He gets his first exposure to like Western missionaries. He kind of becomes, I don't know if aware is the right word, but he gets the opinion that his wife, Mao Fumei, is sort of uneducated, and he becomes a little embarrassed by her. While he's there, he gets really deeply shaped by the Neo-Confucianist emphasis on character development, self-discipline, cultivation of the self, kind of the early self-help.
The early self-help. I like that.
Right. And, you know, they place a lot of emphasis on like duty, courage, honor, and activism. At the same time, he's also being shaped sort of by like what's going on politically in China, a lot of like loss of sovereignty, repeated military defeats, and that sort of thing. But I think you should probably expand on that.
So, you know, around the time that Chiang is born, you have this sort of clashing of worlds. China, over centuries, millennia, had developed a worldview in which they had seen themselves as the center of the sort of...
the Middle Kingdom.
Right, the center of the world, you know, and you had outside of there were barbarians to the east, west, north, south. And they had developed political systems within that framework. But in the 19th century, you have the arrival of Western Europeans, and they start to change that framework. And, you know, they impose upon China their own sort of political worldview. So across the 19th century, you start to see a number of sort of political and military defeats that really shake China to its core, because it forces this sort of realization that China is not the center of the universe, center of the world. And, the first major incident that we usually point to is the Opium War in the late 1830s, 1840s. And that's where, you start to have that first prying open of China. And then from there, you have a lot of British concessions and French concessions, particularly in Shanghai, and Hong Kong becomes a British colony. So you see the loss of a lot of China's sovereignty across the 19th century, and this greatly shaped many of the Chinese that grew up in the 19th century and into the 20th century. For Chiang, what he's seeing is basically this loss of sovereignty, and he's already thinking, okay, what do we need to do to right these wrongs that we're seeing?
Was it more of a critique is probably not the right word, but you know what I mean? Is he more frustrated, or were the people at this time more frustrated with the outside powers, or were they more frustrated with the Qing dynasty?
So this is great question. That's a historical seminar type question. Well, no, I think
I just asked that because obviously we see these revolutionary movements start happening around this time.
So what a lot of people don't realize about China is that China is actually a very diverse place.
Right.
There are currently, I believe what we say is 56 minorities or nationalities in China. And the Qing Empire was actually what many of them at the time would have called a foreign or alien empire, because they actually came from, the Qing or the Manchu came from what nowadays we call Dongbei or Manchuria. And they imposed this empire upon China. Now, I think what a lot of Chinese would have said at the time during this period was that you really had two groups. You had reformers and you had revolutionaries. And the reformers were willing to kind of work with the Qing and say, well, we just need to change some things, adopt this sort of Western scientific approach and build up the military, and we can
play the
things.
Game to change the game.
Yes. And then you have the revolutionaries who are like, we need to get rid of the Qing because the Qing are holding us back. If it wasn't for the Qing, we wouldn't be in this state of weakness.
Flip the board.
Right. So it's interesting because the Qing come to power in China in 1644, and they are the most dominant military force in probably Asia at the time. But by the time the 19th century rolls around, they are getting hammered not only by Western forces that are much smaller, but they're also being decimated by internal revolts. So you have, obviously, the major Taiping Rebellion, but there were at least there were a number of rebellions that were also weakening the Qing at the time. So, yeah, the Qing, they politically were losing strength, and many Chinese would have pointed to the Qing as being the reason why China is weakening at this point in time.
So at some point, Chiang actually leaves the Phoenix Mountain Academy and transfers to Golden Arrow Academy in Ningbo.
I'm going to help you with that, Ningbo.
It's fine. I'm not going to be able to ever say it any different than Ningbo. So anyway, he's being influenced by all this stuff that's going on within China, but then he's also at the same time, around the same time, seeing the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah, so Japan and China both experienced that sort of shocking interaction with the West. Now, both of them embarked on a series of reforms in order to catch up with the West or to restructure themselves in order to be able to actually compete with the West. The difference is that the Chinese were pretty much unsuccessful in that first 100 years or so.
Yeah.
The Japanese, however, were far more successful. So in a short period of time, the Japanese go from being a very poor country to revitalizing the country's economy and its military. And in 1904, 1905, they actually become the first Asian nation to defeat a European nation.
Sure.
And this was absolutely massive. So you've got the Chinese that are looking over here thinking, we've tried to modernize and we've failed. And here are the Japanese, they're like us, and they have managed to defeat the West. Now, this was a bittersweet moment because the Japanese had also directed their war machine against China 10 years earlier, and the Chinese, despite their attempts to modernize, lost easily to the Japanese. So, they're looking at this and they're saying, wow, there's a lot that we can learn from Japan. And this is kind of reverberating around the world. There's even people in, African Americans in the US that are like, wow, look at these Japanese guys, maybe we can learn a thing or two from them. It's a big moment in 1906 when the Japanese are victorious in the Russo-Japanese War, and it, was shocking for China. And this actually...
It's kind of a turning point for Chiang, because I believe, if my notes are correct, that Taylor points to this moment, or right around this moment, is the point where he starts to see himself as a Republican revolutionary and not as someone who would be like a defender of the dynasty.
A reformer, right?
Right.
So that's when he realizes, and a lot of other Chinese realize, we're going to go to Japan to learn and see what they've done and how how they're doing things. And he cuts his queue, which is a very symbolic act, because under the Manchu, all the men had to have this same haircut. If you've ever watched some of those older Chinese films, it's the one with the sort of the front of the head is shaved bald, and then you have a long ponytail. Now, wearing your hair this way was a sign of obedience to the new empire. If you did not agree to wear your hair this way, initially that was something that was punishable by death. So at this point in time, when you have all of these Chinese Qing subjects, when they're cutting their queue, it's a sort of declaration of their revolutionary identity. So it was him cutting his queue and, going off to Japan. That was sort of his first steps as being, a revolutionary.
Okay. And then in Japan, he's at this military academy. He's, I'm assuming, paying for this out of the money that was coming from the property that he owned or his family owned.
Yeah. He was just self-supporting in Japan, learning Japanese and hanging around. He returned, to China momentarily and went to the Baoding Academy and passed an exam there that allowed him to return to Japan for military training. From there, he returns to Tokyo and enters the Shimbugakko, which is a sort of training academy for Chinese in Japan. And during this time, getting away from the military, he develops a penchant for prostitutes. Now, he also runs into this guy, Chen Qimei, who becomes a mentor for him. And at one point in time, he returns to Shanghai during this period. This is in 1909. And while he's in Shanghai, he basically decides that he is going to divorce his wife, whom it seems like he hated from the beginning.
It really did not seem like he liked her or had any affection whatsoever.
Right. So, Arif, what happens?
Well, Mom puts her foot down. She's like, no, because she had gone to see a fortune teller, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
And the fortune teller had told her that they were going to have a son and that he was going to grow into be an important official. And so that they needed to pop out a child now.
Now, that's a pretty good fortune teller, if you ask me.
Yeah.
But the only thing that seemed to persuade Chiang in this case was his mother was just like, you're either going to stay married to her or I'm killing myself.
Yeah.
You can choose.
And, we already talked that he loved his mom.
What a good son.
What a good son. He stayed married to this woman that he didn't like at all and even had a kid.
Now, less than a year later, they have a son, Chiang Kuo.
Ching Kuo. That's what I'm going with.
He was born on April 27th, 1910. And in that same year, Chiang graduates from the Shimbugakko.
And while he's still in Japan, people like Sun Yat-sen and his mentor, Chen Qimei, they were planning a revolution against the Qing Empire, which was the 1911 revolution.
Yeah, so we're going to give you guys a quick rundown, basically Cliff Notes version of the 1911 revolution. So on October 9th, there was an explosion at one of the rebels' secret bomb-making factories. Now, it's kind of weird because they had tried to spark this revolution a number of times, and it always failed. And even this time, it was sort of kind of a bumbling entry into the revolution. So, as I was saying, on October 9th, an explosion in one of the rebel secret bomb-making factories in Wuhan alerted the authorities to the plot. The police gained a copy of the Revolutionary Alliance membership list and began arresting...
comical to me. That They're just like... They had a Revolutionary Alliance membership list.
It's like, let's write down the names of every person who's important to this revolution.
Right.
I can't see how this will go wrong.
No.
So the police grabbed this list and began arresting suspected soldiers and revolutionaries. So what ends up happening, though, on Double 10 Day, October 10th, is that the rebel officers and sergeants in the 8th Division responded by shooting loyalist officers. So basically what ends up happening is this whole situation forces the revolutionaries' hands. So they either turn themselves in and get killed by the Qing, or we can start the revolution.
We can start shooting people.
Right. So the revolution was on, and basically it starts this domino effect of more and more people defecting from the Qing to the revolutionaries, and ultimately the Qing are unable to stand. So when Jiang hears about this, he's in Japan, and him and his buddies, because they're all at this training school where the Chinese guys are learning to be soldiers.
Realistically, they were probably at a brothel when they heard about it.
There's a good chance they were at a brothel, but they mounted up as quickly as possible.
Mount up.
And headed back to China. And, Chiang at this point in time, he starts to become active in the revolution, and he's put in charge of this group called the Dare to Die Squad.
Which sounds so much cooler than it really was.
Yeah, but ultimately, they really didn't do a whole lot in the revolution itself. In fact, when we'll get into this later, but when people are looking for the revolutionaries later on, they're like, Chiang Kai-shek? Don't know who that is.
Don't know that name.
Yeah.
Keep it moving.
So ultimately, the Qing collapsed, and the revolutionaries convened a provisional national assembly in Nanjing, which was dominated by Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Alliance. Sun was appointed president, but was at odds with this guy named Yuan Shikai. He was an army general from northern China.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Sun Yat-sen was like a medical doctor, wasn't he?
Yeah, Sun Yat-sen, he's a kind of interesting guy. He was trained as a medical doctor where he actually studied in Hawaii.
Okay.
So throughout a lot of this, he wasn't even in China. He was actually, he's as much a part of the overseas Chinese community as he is sort of the Chinese that were still in China at the time community. So yeah, he wasn't, Sun Yat-sen wasn't no killer.
No. But it just strikes me as kind of odd that I guess this guy who was not even necessarily in China a lot became like the head of a revolution.
Yeah, the way that he pulled it all together is rather remarkable, but it was also kind of, he was the guy with the idea, the plan. But as this story will bear out for the Revolutionary Alliance, or the Tongmenghui, is that you need guns. And basically in this situation, Yuan Shikai had all of the guns.
Shocking that the general would have them and not the doctor.
Right. So ultimately, the dispute between the two of them, Sun ends up backing down. And on March 12th, 1912, Yuan Shikai becomes president.
And if I recall correctly from Taylor's book, even though Chiang really backed Sun Yat-sen, he respected the fact that he was willing to step down for the good of the party or the good of the revolution. Yeah.
I mean, I think that Chiang could understand what Sun was doing, but right when that happens, Chiang and his, the guy that he's with, Chen, they're already thinking,
we might need another revolution.
Yeah, there's another revolution coming down the pipe. So that's what that begins the second sort of revolution.
Yeah, so we have the first revolution in 1911, and then
it gets hijacked by Yuan Shikai.
Yeah. And then in March 1913,
the KMT won control of the National Assembly.
Can we pause real quick and just talk about this? How are you going to pronounce the name of the party?
So there's two ways to pronounce it. There's the KMT and there's the GMD.
Right.
Again, this is the same issue. This is today we use pinyin, so we more often say GMD, but I'm okay with using KMT.
And if you were going to say what those letters stand for, how would you pronounce it?
Kuomintang.
Oh, wow.
Which means National Party.
All right, just wanted to check. So if you hear me butcher that word, we're talking about the same thing.
You would say Kuomintang or Kuomintang.
I'm probably just going to say KMT.
Yeah, fair enough. Where were we? The KMT won control of the National Assembly with Yuan Shikai, who was in charge. Yuan Shikai was in charge at this time, which raised tensions between Yuan and the party. But Chiang at this time was, so to back up a little bit, Yuan Shikai goes around pretty much rounding up all of the loyalist members of the KMT and is getting rid of them in a lot of cases.
And when you say loyalist, you mean loyal to?
Sun Yat-sen.
Okay.
Because realistically, the KMT wasn't Yuan Shikai's party.
Sure. He just jumped to the head of it.
Chiang Kai-shek was too small of a fish to get caught in this dragnet, so he was able to flee off to Japan and get away from all of this violence that's going on. But in the meantime, he had fallen in love with another woman named Yao Yicheng,
who he met in one of his favorite places.
A brothel.
So
when he finally, when he gets to Japan, that's when he finally gets his chance to meet Sun Yat-sen, because up until this point in time, he'd never met him.
And from what Taylor had written about this meeting, it seems that Chiang Kai-shek made a pretty good impression on Sun Yat-sen during the time they spent together there. Chiang would go on several dangerous missions into China, a lot of narrow escapes, action-packed adventures.
Yeah, and this was between, 1913 and 1914?
Yeah, between 1913 and 1914. And then, January 18th, 1915, Japan issues the 21 demands.
Yeah, so this is where things kind of get a little hairy. So Japan, by this point in time, if I can say so, is becoming a little belligerent, I guess, is the way that I might put it. So they basically force upon China these 21 demands where they're trying to gain economic control of Manchuria and the Shandong province. And this is a big issue for Sun Yat-sen because obviously the Chinese don't want to see any more erosion of their sovereignty. But what's unfortunate for Sun Yat-sen at this point in time is that he's kind of still closely connected with the Japanese. So he puts out the sort of the feeling that he'd be willing to give into many of these demands because he sees Japan playing an important role in China's, future and development.
And also, Japan is issuing these demands to Yuan Shikai's government. So it's sort of, the way I read it anyway, was sort of like an enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of deal.
Yeah, there's definitely that potential there. But ultimately, it doesn't look good for Chiang Kai-shek because of the rising nationalism in China. Sure. And he's not, I'm sorry, not Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen, because of the rising nationalism in China. And, in this moment, he seems to be out of tune with that.
Okay.
But they kind of come up with, this is where we start to see the development of the idea of that you need to first pacify everything inside of China, pacify the interior, and then you can deal with China's external threats. So this can be seen as sort of Sun Yat-sen's efforts to pacify the issues that are going on in China, and they would deal with the external threats later. This ultimately becomes one of Chiang Kai-shek's calling cards, but we'll revisit this later as we discuss the Chinese Civil War.
So then in 1914, Chen Chimei, he was assassinated in 1914, likely paid by northern warlords, which, again, the fact that there are northern warlords is one of those things that you kind of like double take when you read that. You're like, because I mean, honestly, when you just read about this period, it's easy to forget that while there's a revolution and this dynasty had just been overthrown, there are now literal warlords controlling large armies.
Yeah, throughout different parts of China. It's hard to imagine, especially for people who are familiar with, post-1949 modern China, where it's this pretty stable, state.
Pretty much like modern, like now, just in general. You know what I mean? When you think of like a modern state, there aren't many places where there are warlords.
Yeah, I mean, the term just even sounds weird to us.
Yeah.
Like, warlords. Ooh, that sounds like history. Yeah, so he's assassinated, and Chiang Kai-shek positions himself to kind of take the spot that Chen Chimei had. And he, at the funeral says, "Who is there besides myself to continue your work?" So, take that however you want, whether that's the appropriate place to say things like that. In addition to Chen Chimei's death, the whole controversy around Yuan Shikai comes to a close in 1916 because Yuan Shikai suddenly dies. So now there's no central leader, and they don't have to worry about Yuan Shikai and all of his big guns. Now, in September of 1917, this is when Chiang Kai-shek submits to Sun Yat-sen his plan to sort of retake China, which they call the Northern Punitive Expedition.
So the Northern Punitive Expedition gets shelved for a while, and Sun Yat-sen instead sends Chiang to join, say this name for me?
Chen Zhongming.
His army, and train in Fujian province.
Fujian.
And so he is training there, leading some expeditions. While he was there, he takes up a new lover named Jimei, and he becomes estranged with his concubine, Yao Yicheng. It's at this point where I mentioned earlier that this frequenting of brothels and promiscuity would come back to bite him.
Yeah, because I mean, one thing that's interesting is by this point, he's, besides the other sort of less notable women that he might be seeing, he has his wife, a concubine, and now, like, what do you call the second concubine?
Side chick?
Yeah. But, to be fair to Chiang at this time, may not have been all that, for someone of his status, all that unusual.
Right. But he was still running around, just in general.
Yeah, STDs don't care.
So he contracted several STDs, and he believed that contracting these STDs had left him sterile, which in turn led him to place more of an emphasis on having a relationship with his son because he thought he probably wasn't going to have any more kids.
Yeah, but that wasn't the only thing that was going on for Chiang Kai-shek at that point in time. In October, now this is going a little bit back, this is global history. You have the October Revolution in 1917, which is basically the communist revolution in Russia. And then you also have the May 4th movement 2 years later in 1919. The May 4th movement sort of grows out of the negotiations at the end of the First World War. So when they were negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, a question had arisen as to what to do with the German possessions in China, which were centralized in Shandong. And initially, the idea was that this territory would be returned to the Chinese. However, it was returned to the Japanese instead.
Which makes sense,
Give it to the people who it didn't belong to.
Exactly.
The Japanese, during World War I, did fight on the side of the Allies, and they did take some of these territories in Germany. Sure. But obviously, this is territory that should have been returned to China.
But this was not, from a historical perspective, anything new.
No.
It's not strange that they thought that, we will just give this chunk of land in one country to a different, more powerful country.
Right. And this touches off a massive series of protests in China, which we typically just refer to as the May 4th movement, that starts out all these discussions about how Chinese culture needs to be changed and how, we need to develop a strong Chinese state so that we can obviously reclaim this, the sovereignty that's been lost, but also, the Chinese people can stand up to these foreign powers. So Chiang sees this, and this is when he starts to see, for the first time, what he thinks is a real sort of national sentiment in China. People thinking that there is a sort of Chinese nation. Because I think for us nowadays, we always think within the framework of the nation. But this is at a time when really the nation state was relatively new. I mean, there's a lot of these places in Europe that you don't have a national identity, even in the 19th century. Germany had just become Germany.
Right.
So it's taken a little bit of time in China, but now Chiang Kai-shek is looking at this saying, hey, we're getting there.
We're going to fast forward 2 years, 1921?
1921. So April of 1921, Chiang joins Sun Yat-sen for the invasion of Guangdong. But at that time, he has a dream of white and boundless snow.
In quotations.
Which means what, Arif?
It was sort of like a vision that his mother was going to die.
And apparently, again, like the fortune teller, spot on, because his mom died.
And while Sun Yat-sen's invasion was successful, Chiang Kai-shek went back home to observe a period of mourning for his mother. And so while he's there, all this time, Sun Yat-sen's invasion is continuing. And he is calling on Chiang because he's like, hey,
kind of miss the party.
Right, you're going to miss this. But he continues his period of mourning and sort of ignores those calls until he feels that he had done enough mourning, I guess.
Yeah, and eventually he decides that he's going to head down to southern China and join up with Sun Yat-sen and take part in the invasion. But meanwhile, on the way, he stops in Shanghai, and he had amassed a small fortune in Mexican silver dollars, but he was like, I'm gonna invest some of this.
And by invest, he meant just lose all of it.
He did all right initially, but ultimately he loses a small fortune by 1922, which starts to shape some of his ideas about capitalism and things like that. But that's neither here nor there. He also, to digress even further, met another woman whose name was Chen Jieru. And this is okay by this point in time, because once his mother dies, he's like, I can finally divorce my wife.
Yeah, but I mean, that hadn't slowed him down in the past.
That's a good point. What did he say about his wife? I've not been able to bear hearing the sound of her footsteps or see her shadow. Wow.
So yeah, if it hasn't been clear that he didn't enjoy being married, he didn't enjoy being married.
Well, he enjoyed it enough to try to get married to Chen Jieru, and her parents said that it was cool. But unfortunately for her, she believes that she contracted an STD on their honeymoon. And in response, Chiang, he apologizes and then sort of takes up this very Spartan lifestyle where he stops drinking wine and tea and only drinks boiled water and eats pretty plain food.
Yeah, from reading Taylor's account of Chiang's life, it seems like sort of this period, and for me, I'm kind of rolling his mother's death into like this period, kind of marked like a turning point in his life where with the death of his mother, he kind of began to commit to becoming a great person in history and to potentially take Sun Yat-sen's place as the leader of the party when he either dies or steps down. And then this happens, and from this point forward, it could be cultivated, but Chiang Kai-shek sort of has this reputation of having a Spartan lifestyle and not being someone who is indulgent and all that sort of thing. So it sort of seems like this time, these mother's death, giving his new wife a STD, are really like a turning point for him.
Never heard it put that way, but I think you're onto something.
There you go. My contribution to the historiography.
Now, while he's on his way down, Sun Yat-sen suffers another setback. So the revolution is really struggling. He'd been working with the warlord Chen Zhongming, who was a southern military ruler of Guangdong and Yunnan. Following their initial success in the invasion of Guangxi, Sun removed Chen as the governor of Guangdong and the commander of the Guangdong army. Chen's forces in Canton, which I believe is Guangzhou.
Northeast Ohio.
No, this is not Northeast Ohio. Get out of here, LeBron. His forces in Canton then tried to seize power, which forced Sun to flee the area in the dead of night. And while he was away, Sun sent out an emergency call to Chiang and had him meet him on a ship called the Yongfeng, which was anchored off of Huangpoa, which is in and around Shanghai. Now, the battle between Chen and Sun's forces raged for a few more weeks, and ultimately Sun's forces were defeated. But this is the moment where Chiang really establishes himself with Sun Yat-sen.
As the right-hand man.
Yeah, he can see him as like, okay, this guy is loyal. And one thing that aided him was that really Chiang didn't have any other loyalties. He was like, wow, this guy doesn't have anybody that he's going to betray me for. So, he's good to go. And this time, I think Sun finally decides, like, this is the last time I'm ever going to get caught lacking.
Yeah.
Like, I'm having the best troops, the best guns. We doing it, to the nines from now on. Because, relying on these other military guys or not having a military at all is really slowing us down and almost getting me killed numerous times. And this is where they established the Russian connection.
Which was surprising to me because I guess in my mind, and again, I've already talked about the fact that my knowledge of this whole time period is limited, but to me, whenever I'd thought of Chiang Kai-shek in the past, it had always been as, a warrior against communism and Russians and that sort of stuff. And so when you're reading about this point in his life that there was he was basically a communist. Yeah,
I mean, he had a lot of communist leanings, communist sympathies, and the party at this point in time starts working with Russian agents because the Russians are very interested in, having a friendly China on their borders.
Expanding that sphere of influence.
Right, especially to serve as a buffer against Japan. So they're willing to work with revolutionary groups in China, and the KMT happened to be, number one on their list. So at this point in time, they start funneling weapons, funneling trainers to the KMT, and they're able to establish a training school, which, we call the Whampoa Military Academy.
Right, and that's the same one that he being Chiang Kai-shek, becomes like the head of.
Yeah, he's a high-ranking guy there. And basically, they create this working relationship with these Russian agents. The first agent that they come into contact was the agent codename Mering. And then later on, they formalized the relationship in January 17th, 1923, when Adolf Jaffe visits Sun Yat-sen. So the Soviets agreed to provide weapons, training, and funds, as we've mentioned before. And Chiang is sent to Russia to study Russian military and party systems, and ultimately to secure Russia's support for the Northern Expedition.
He was not going to let that one go.
No, man, we got to get this Northern Expedition going. But, he also has some reservations after visiting Russia. He's like, man, he was in Petrograd, and he's like, this place is not hopping. Like, people here seem pretty sad. But by 1925, Soviet weapons were flowing into the KMT's hands.
Sun was still trying to pacify those northern warlords, too, because he was like, hey, if we don't have to Northern Expedition, maybe we don't.
Right. Now, the other thing is, too, that the Russians were like, maybe you don't want to do this Northern Expedition thing right now.
Chiang Kai-shek was like, no, I do.
Yeah. And they were pushing to create this super close tie between the Chinese Communist Party, which was established just a few years earlier, and the KMT. And basically they said, like, sure, the communists can join the party and work within the party, but we're not going to create like a full-blown equal partnership with them.
Sure.
So they actually started working with the Communist Party. So at this point in time, they're on the same team. The communists and the KMT are together.
One party.
They're essentially, yes, like the CCP is essentially a wing. Now, they're obviously autonomous to it on their own, but they're also a wing within the KMT. And questions that they have begin to arise, right? What's the CCP doing? Are they just using the KMT to grow their own base to a point where they'll finally take over the KMT like a parasite working its way from within? But that'll play out later. But at this point in time, in 1925, Sun Yat-sen's health is declining. And that's actually the year in which he will die as they're preparing for the Northern Expedition. So now you get this brief triangle of leadership that emerges. You have one, Liao Zhongkai, Wang Jingwei, and who's the last one? Xu Chongzhi.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Those are the three people that are essentially in charge of the KMT after Sun Yat-sen's death. And Chiang Kai-shek could have been in this group, but he, at this point in time, was a firm believer in the military guys need to stay out of the sort of politicking. So he declined to join this group, which only added to his mystique at the time. But this group was not long for the world. One of the first guys, Liao Zhongkai, he's actually assassinated in August of 1925. So he didn't last much past Sun Yat-sen's death. And then the other guy, Xu Chongzhi, he is implicated in this guy's death. I'm not sure if he actually had anything to do with it, but they nonetheless thought that he did. And then to make matters worse, he got in touch with that warlord that turned on Sun Yat-sen years earlier. So now they oust that guy. So the only person who's left of the original three is Wang Jingwei. This is when they bring in Chiang Kai-shek. And now you have the two most powerful people in the KMT are Wang Jingwei and Chiang Kai-shek.
Look at that rise.
Mm-hmm. Swift.
Kind of like Eisenhower.
Yeah. Not quite as swift as Eisenhower.
Right.
But, to be fair, though, he's the guy with the guns, Wang Jingwei is still kind of on the political side of the KMT, and you've got Chiang Kai-shek on the more military side. But while all this is going on, there's rumblings inside the KMT. You have the rise of the sort of leftist and communist bloc in the KMT. And the CCP's sort of membership is rapidly growing during this time. And, they're actually some of the best workers that they have in the KMT.
Why was their membership rising so quick right at this time? Like, what was so appealing about them?
I don't know. I think in a lot of ways where there was a lot of corruption around China, these guys were actually pretty dedicated to what they were doing. I think they maybe just had a very sound vision of the revolution and kind of conducted themselves in a way that, brought people into their fold. As a matter of fact, Chiang at this time was pretty pro-communist. He didn't really have a problem with them at the time. In fact, one of his close buddies during this time was Zhou Enlai.
Good old Joe.
Yeah, who becomes a key figure in the People's Republic of China and the revolutionary story that leads into that.
So now you have Chiang Kai-shek in this position of power, and he has been rearing and ready to go with the Northern Expedition for some time. And this sort of creates tension between him and the Soviet advisors because, again, he was all about it. And Stalin was like, hey, two things. First of all, if you do this, this might lead to some retaliation from Japan. And also, they have like 10 times more people than you do.
Yeah, Stalin's trying to pump the brakes on this one. And this creates tension between, obviously, Chiang and the people who are ready to go with the Northern Expedition and the leftist faction that's like, we might want to think about this.
Question. By this point, and we've touched on it a little bit, but Taylor really dives into it. Chiang Kai-shek did not like the idea of like foreign interlopers.
Mm-hmm.
Was there like a dislike of Stalin in the same way that there might have been of like a Western power?
That's a really good question. So, okay, to answer that question, I think what we can say is that during this time, initially, as I mentioned earlier, Chiang doesn't have a problem with the communists, but that's slowly but surely starting to change. There's a lot of rumors within the party that basically the communists are just biding their time, and then they're going to take over the party. And Chiang, I think, initially doesn't believe this, but there's a very influential faction within the party known as the Western Hills Clique, and they are absolutely against the communists. They believe that the communists are trying to subvert the party, and they start spreading rumors around that there's a plot and that Wang Jingwei and the Russians are trying to get rid of Chiang. And as a result, Chiang is becoming more and more worried about the CCP. He's like, hold up. Like, maybe these guys are actually trying to take me out and take over the party. So
then they call him to Moscow.
Yeah, so then he gets orders. They're like, hey, we need you to go to Moscow. And
he's
Chiang's
like, hey, no.
That doesn't sound like a good idea. And then they keep asking about his schedule. Like on, I believe it was March 20th, Wang Jingwei keeps asking, like, hey, so like, what are you doing today? Where are you going to be?
Tell me exactly where you'll be.
It may not have been March 20th. It may have been shortly before March 20th, 1926. But they're like, where are you going? I need to know exactly where you'll be. How many bodyguards are you going to have? And Chiang at that point is just like, oh no, something's up. Something's up. So he declares martial law March 20th, 1926 in Canton. But he eventually sort of backs away from this. And before he backed away from this, though, he was arresting all the suspected communist and Russian guys that were there. But ultimately, Chiang kind of pulls back on this one. And then they still need the support that they're getting from the Russians. So he writes an apology. He's like, hey, didn't mean to send my boys over to hang out over at your place. And he went and requested a reprimand from the KMT Executive Committee, and they refused. They were like, you know what, you did wrong, but we ain't gonna reprimand you. Shockingly, on June 5th, he was named Commander-in-Chief of the National Revolutionary Army and the Northern Expedition. And this is at the point when we start to call him the Generalissimo.
Or I've seen it sometimes as like GMO. Is that it?
GMO, they're like GMO for short.
Yeah. Now, another quick question. So, basically, listeners, that's where we're going to pause. We'll actually jump into the actual Northern Expedition when we come back next week. But I do have a question real quick before we go. During all this, how closely is Western media paying attention to the rise of the KMT and like the CCP?
Yeah, the Western media has its eyes on China during this time.
Sure.
China and Japan. Because we often talk about China being this place where all of these Western powers were coming to sort of get rich and fatten themselves at the expense of China. So all these different countries, the United States, France, England, they all have possessions in China. And the sort of development of this revolutionary movement in China influences kind of their business.
Sure.
So they're keeping track of this, right? Because let's say, for example, there's in Shanghai, at this time, there was a French concession, a British concession. In Tianjin, there's an Italian concession. And the question is, when the Northern Expedition rolls through.
And when you say concession, just for people who don't know, you mean like small communities, correct?
Yeah, so basically these were communities that were carved out from Chinese cities that were basically under the rule of a foreign country.
Okay.
So this was a big issue for Chinese at the time. Because it's a place. Imagine if in New York there was like
a couple blocks.
Queens was controlled by Russia, and you're just like, why are these Russians controlling Queens? And these New Yorkers were being from time to time mistreated by the Russians, but you couldn't do anything about it because the Russians are like, hey, this is our concession. Get out of here. Don't worry about it. But one question that they would have is, as this new revolutionary army moves through, are they going to honor these concessions? Because if they don't, then obviously the British are like, we're going to have a problem. So the foreign countries, in the West and in Japan, they are watching this intently.
All right, cool. Well then, like I said, we will wrap up here, and next week we will be back. We will dive into the actual Northern Expedition, and we will see where that takes Chiang Kai-shek. Before we get out of here real quick, though, just want to remind you one more time again, if you like what we're doing here at Life of X, The best way for you to help us out is to leave us a 5-star rating and review, primarily in iTunes, but pretty much anywhere you're listening to this. But if iTunes is the big one, that's where most people go to look for their podcasts. Tell a friend if you know anyone who you think might be interested in anything that we're doing here. Please let them know. That's how a lot of stuff about podcasts gets out. It's just word of mouth. And if you're looking for any other way, please head over to lifeofxpodcast.com and click through to our support page.
And when you leave those reviews, leave your address, and we'll send you a 5-spot.
That is
do not do
true.
that.
That is
do not
true.
do that. Do not leave your address. Please,
please do not leave any contact information on your review. That is public knowledge.
Jeez, Arif, why would you tell the people to do that?
I must be very irresponsible. Anyway, we are going to sign off. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
Toodles.